Good evening, everybody. On behalf of Provost Tim Marshall, who wanted very much to be here but is in a different time zone and so couldn't, I am very happy to welcome you here tonight. My name is Joel Towers. I'm the Dean of Parsons School of Design here at the New School. And I'm kind of glad Tim's not here because this is the kind of event that I love to be at. Not because I don't want Tim being here, but it's a real honor to be able to really just say a couple of words of introduction. Mostly what I will be doing is handing this off to my friend and colleague, Michelle DePass, who is the Dean of the Milano School of International Affairs, Management and Urban Policy. That is one of her titles. She is also the Tishman Professor of Environmental Policy and Management, and she is the Director of the Tishman Environment and Design Center, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But those three titles give you a sense of the comprehensive and significant work that Michelle does here at the university. But she's also one of the most extraordinary collaborators that I've had the privilege of working with, and I've been here 13 years. So working with Michelle has enabled all of us across the university to extend our work around environment, climate justice, and issues that are so deeply embedded in the core mission of this university. And so we are so pleased that she is here, and I'm really honored to introduce her. I will also tell you that tonight's event is part of the Nth Degree series. You see this, if you ever see this circle, you know you're at an Nth Degree event. This is a new initiative here at the university focused on creative minds creating change. And it's a curated series of events featuring thinkers, visionaries, and creators who bring about positive change in the world. The idea for this series continues the New School's century-long tradition of forward thinking and spotlighting lectures, performances, panels, and other public programs that really galvanize the public interest and curious minds. Tonight is a really special event, however, even in the context of the Nth Degree series. It is, this week marks the 25th anniversary of the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, where the 17 principles of environmental justice were written and adopted. And Michelle's going to speak more about that in just a moment. But the idea of this evening was to mark that event and to continue that work forward. And we have an extraordinary panel who Michelle will introduce to do that work. The New School is really quite unique, I think, in our interdisciplinary approach to working on environmental issues. We endeavor to incorporate all of the areas of the university in design and policy, social sciences and social justice as part of our approach. And the Tishman Center that Michelle directs is really the place where we bring all of that together. It's the core of our commitment to design, to environment and policy and social justice, and bringing these things together under her leadership these last years has really raised that to new heights at the university. So it's with extraordinary pleasure and deep friendship that I give you Michelle DePass.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I actually have an opening, and I've had so many pieces of paper that I cannot locate it. So this is what happens when you actually. Could this be it?
That's part of it.
It could be. This is what happens when you actually print things out. Well.
I talked longer while you were finding
Yeah, exactly. I was like, Joel, talk. Well, I'm actually going to ask Molly to come into my iPad and pull up my opening. But in the meantime, hi everyone. How are you? So this is really a thrill for me because over the course of the past few years that I have been at the New School, we've had an opportunity to really curate some really incredible academic leadership here in the environmental and environmental justice space. Not only solidly in the environmental justice space, you will hear from these incredible women how they intersect, not always, but sometimes in terms of policy, space, land use, community work, in and around environmental justice. And that is what we really wanted to do this evening, to be able to lift up just the cross the spectrum interdisciplinary opportunities for you all as students, alumni, faculty, staff, to be able to engage on environmental justice. So let me start before I actually do the framing in introducing our panelists this evening. So first of all, to my right, 3 from me, is Maya Wiley. Maya Wiley is our Senior Vice President, thank you, Molly, for Social Justice and the Henry Cohen Professor of Urban Policy and Management at the New School. Maya served as counsel to Mayor Bill de Blasio, where she advised de Blasio on a range of legal issues and worked to bring digital equity to more than 16,000 New York City residents living in 5 of the city's public housing developments by providing them with affordable broadband access. She has worked at Columbia University's AIDS Anti-Discrimination Law Clinic to create equity and justice for people living with AIDS, founded and served as president of the Center for Social Inclusion, a national policy strategy organization on racial inclusion, and developed programs to transform structural racism in the US and South Africa. Maya holds her JD from Columbia University Law School. Welcome, Henry Cohen Professor Maya Wiley. Mia White is currently an assistant professor of environmental studies here at the New School. Mia is 2 from me. Mia is an expert in the intersection of Black studies, environmental studies, critical urban studies, political ecology, social movements, and community development. She has worked for the Ford Foundation in Sustainable Community and Resource Development and Environmental Justice, the Robin Hood Foundation in post-9/11 redevelopment, and at the Ms. Foundation for Women in Advocacy, Democracy, and Post-Katrina redevelopment. Mia holds a PhD from Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Urban Studies and Planning. Welcome, Professor White. Mindy Fullilove, to my direct left, is a professor of urban policy and health at the New School, Milano. Dr. Mindy Fullilove is a board-certified psychiatrist who examines links between the environment and mental health. She started her research career in 1986 with a focus on the AIDS epidemic and became aware of the close link between AIDS and places of residence. Using psychology of place, Dr. Fullilove has examined the mental health effects of such environmental processes as violence, rebuilding, segregation, urban renewal, and mismanaged toxins. Mindy holds an MD from Columbia University in medicine. Welcome, Professor Fullilove. And Dr. Anna Baptista, who is actually the most senior here in terms of time here at the university, both Maya, Mia, and Mindy are actually recent faculty hires, so we've been busy. Dr. Baptista is the chair of the master's program in environmental policy and sustainability management here at the New School and associate director of the Tishman Environment and Design Center. Anna grew up in the Ironbound community in Newark, New Jersey, and was the director of environmental and planning programs for the Ironbound Community Corporation, where she oversaw a wide range of environmental justice, community development, and community-based planning for the Ironbound community. She was most recently the director of the Energy and Environment Program at the Regional Plan Association, where she oversaw a diverse portfolio of issues ranging from climate change to green space preservation across the New York metropolitan region. Anna holds a PhD from Rutgers University in urban planning. Welcome, Dr. Baptista. So when you walked in here this evening, I think you were treated to some really beautiful music. And in true form of the environmental justice movements, you must acknowledge the things you hear, the people you know, the history that comes before you. So climbing poetry, who were the poets that you heard, are Alixa Garcia and Naima Penniman. And over the last 13 years, climbing poetry has infused movements for justice with healing, inspiring sounds through their multimedia theater, dual voice spoken word, visual art, sustainable touring, and community organizing. So I invite you to learn more about climbing poetry. Both Anna and I were at an event a couple weeks ago where we retreated to them for about an hour, and it was absolutely beautiful, powerful, powerful work. So let's frame this discussion we're going to have this evening with these very powerful voices up here. We are, as Joel said, 25 years in history, almost exactly to the day, 25 years ago on October 24th to 27th, over 300 Black, Latino, Native, and Asian Pacific Islander American delegates gathered in Washington, D.C. for the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. How many people in here actually knew about the first Environmental Justice Summit? Raise your hands. This is great. We have such an opportunity to educate. That's fantastic. Many of these delegates are people that we all know and work with and admire, and this is really a celebration of the anniversary of the summit, as well as an exploration into the ways that academia can contribute to the discussion, research, and actions of the environmental justice movement. Dana Alston, an advocate for environmental and social justice and a co-convener of the summit, described the purpose and guiding ideals of the summit this way, and I quote, "Joined by delegates from Puerto Rico, Canada, Central and South America, and the Marshall Islands, these present at the meeting in Washington, D.C., set in motion a process of redefining environmental issues in their own terms. People of color gathered not in reaction to the environmental movement, but rather to reaffirm their traditional connection to and respect for the natural world, and to speak for themselves on some of the most critical issues of our time. For people of color, the environment is woven into an overall framework and understanding of social, racial, and economic justice. The definitions that emerge from the environmental justice movement led by people of color are deeply rooted in culture, in spirituality, and encompass all aspects of daily life, where we live, where we work, and where we play. This broad understanding of environment is a context within which to address a variety of questions about militarism and defense, religious freedom, cultural survival, energy and sustainable development, transportation and housing, land and sovereignty rights, self-determination, and employment. These words of Dana have rang true to this day, and we really have to lift up and acknowledge Dana, who is not with us anymore, as one of the real pillars in terms of the environmental justice movement. So delegates to the summit exchanged stories of environmental racism that were experienced by their communities, which were routinely targeted for disposal of toxic waste or the placement of hazardous industries. They noted not just the environmental impacts of these practices, but the human health effects like cancer, birth defects, asthma, miscarriages. Delegates to the summit worked to develop solutions and policy proposals to support a just and equitable approach to address this environmental crisis as they saw it. The ecological impact of war, underground nuclear testing, the international waste trade, and U.S. foreign aid and trade policies. Through a process of consensus building, they also penned and adopted the 17 Principles of Environmental Justice to guide the movement to eradicate the environmental racism and bring into being true social justice and self-determination. And earlier we were flashing the principles, and we'll be discussing them as well. Now we are gathered here on the 25th anniversary of the adoption of the principles to explore the theme of the principles and opportunities for achieving environmental justice across different social movements. the practices, and multidisciplinary perspectives. Many of the concerns voiced by the delegates 25 years ago are still very real today. In 2014, activists took to the streets, led by frontline communities, to advocate for global action on climate change in the People's Climate March. In 2015, outside the closed doors of the COP in Paris, we saw a growing unification of movements for climate justice, the deepening of transnational solidarity movements across the globe, and the creative expressions of people and communities determined to achieving solutions to the climate crisis in their own terms. Last year, we looked on in disbelief when the news broke about the lead and other contaminants poisoning the water in Flint, Michigan, a community that is 56% African American, and closer to home in Newark, New Jersey. Just last night, I, along with Joel and Anna, were with Mayor Karen Weaver of Flint, Michigan, who were reminding us that the fight is still very much on, and that they still have to use bottled water, and that there have been 9 deaths and numerous lives that have been impacted and irrevocably harmed by the crisis in Flint. So tonight and in recent weeks, our thoughts are also with the tribal nations and their allies standing in solidarity in opposition to the Dakota Access Pipeline. So tonight we're recognizing that institutional racism and the long history of undervaluing certain people and places have left a persistent legacy of environmental injustice. Pipelines have been stopped by local activists in the past, and they can be stopped today. Technological advances and efforts to promote digital equity are supplying frontline communities and grassroots organizations with new resources with which to advocate for justice, health, and well-being. You are all here and ready to learn from our distinguished faculty and to dialogue on issues of race and environment in the 21st century. So let's all concentrate on finding ways that we can contribute to a more equitable future, and let's get to it. Thank you. So the way we're going to do this evening, because we have so many amazing voices and we want to make sure that you get to hear from everybody, is that we're going to have a couple of opening questions for each of the panelists so that they can ground themselves in the issues that we're speaking about and the issues of environmental justice. And then we'll have a more panel-wide discussion. So I think for the opening question, where I'm going to ask you all, and we'll start with Mindy, and how your professional work and your scholarship really relates to environmental justice broadly, and you can take up to 4 minutes to be able to answer.
Hi. So I don't think she said I'm a psychiatrist. And the particular part of psychiatry that I work in is called social psychiatry, which looks at how social systems relate to the problems of mental health. And I started doing research in AIDS, and because what really became obvious a couple years into the AIDS epidemic was that Blacks and Hispanics were at excess risk for AIDS, meaning the numbers of people with AIDS, among people with AIDS, Black people had higher rates for their numbers in the population than white people. And why was this? So it turns out that the reason for this was the destruction of Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. And one of the principal offenders was the policy of planned shrinkage, massively carried out here in New York in minority neighborhoods. In fact, the birth of hip hop comes out of planned shrinkage, among other things. So the issue of that I've worked on is really, what is the destruction of neighborhoods due to people that leads to the problems that lead to AIDS? So how does it become related to intravenous drug use? And how does it change life in neighborhoods so that people are at sexual risk? And that led me really deeply into the long and terrible history of segregation and what it does to neighborhoods, and to the really trying to grapple with the ways in which this is an ever-evolving, constantly changing, and really ever-worsening problem. The piece of it we're all living with now is gentrification, but we have been through other policies in other decades, including urban renewal and planned shrinkage and disinvestment, deindustrialization, Hope 6 programs, which were directed at federal housing projects, and now gentrification. These have piled up one on another, creating a sorting of the city by race and class, which paralyzes the whole nation. One of the pieces of this is that in disposable places, we have put toxins. So environmental justice becomes a part of this longer story of once you segregate a nation, how do you use the land and how do you use the people? But it becomes more complicated because the places aren't stable. There's no specific place that has to be black. The black people have to be black, but the place doesn't have to be black. So the whole point of gentrification, if you look at Harlem, there's probably not going to be very many black people living in Harlem. Harlem will not be black anymore. So then the toxins that were in Harlem will probably get cleaned up because black people don't live there anymore. And the toxins will go someplace else. So it's a very complicated story, and so what I've tried to contribute is really tracking down this long history of how segregation plays out and how it has become hidden so that what we think of as urban policies are really racial policies, but without ever having to say that. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Mindy. Maya.
Oh.
I mean, sorry, Mia.
No.
Please, Mia.
She only hires people with M names.
I feel very left out. I was going to change my name to Mana.
Mana now.
Hello, everybody. So I'm going to start because in a few minutes we're going to talk. I'm going to get theoretical. So I'm going to open with a more personal set of reflections. So again, my name is Mia White. I'm a New York City kid. I was born in Tarrytown, which is a Westchester suburb. Many of you may know it. And when my parents split up, my mother and I moved to Queens, to Elmhurst, Queens. I'm Afro-Asian, which means I'm Black and Korean. I was going to make a joke, but some people may not get it. So when my mother and I came to Queens, we didn't really have a place to stay at first. So we stayed with a friend of a friend that my mother was waitressing with in Queensbridge South, which is the biggest projects in the United States. And we stayed in a living room. And the reason I'm telling you this is because space has been an obsession of mine from the very beginning. So I'm trying to give you a little bit of a window into my own sort of spatial experiences. So beautiful Tarrytown, green, leafy, Legend of Sleepy Hollow, right? Beautiful Elmhurst, diverse, rich, the projects, the birth of hip hop, Queensbridge South, right? Fast forward a little bit. My mother decided she didn't want to be a waitress anymore. So we had this grand plan that we were going to be street vendors. So that was the plan, and we enacted this plan. We implemented this plan. We sold 3 for $5 socks, 3 for $5 panties, leotards, sunglasses in the summer, fake leather ballet shoes, etc. and so forth. And we were often getting chased from our designated spots, in Manhattan or downtown near, the financial district or other places, because we didn't always have the right permissions. We didn't always have the right permits, et cetera, and so forth, right? So again, so space is sort of constantly on my mind. Who gets to belong where and under what conditions, right? So now fast forward a little bit more. I've always been a little bit rebellious. My mother, Korean immigrant, wanted me to try the violin. Of course, I decided to do the cello. So this was like crazy to my mother, right? You're sitting as a girl, right, with your legs open with the cello, but to me this felt rebellious and strong, and that's what I did. I played the cello in high school, and then and further on, I decided I needed to continue to rebel. My mother wanted me to go to college and be a lawyer. I decided to study monkeys. This absolutely drove my mother crazy. I mean, like, chest pounding, what have I done to deserve this daughter? So I was very, very fortunate at SUNY Stony Brook. They fully funded me to go to Madagascar, and there I studied lemurs. And, 4.5 months, rainforest, in the tent, the whole experience. A month into it, I get an email from my advisor, a wonderful white mentor of mine, white woman, who's in France, and she says, Mia, listen, you're doing a great job. The PhD students tell me you're doing a great job. I was 19 in undergrad, but I want you to do this thing for me. I want you to go and do this survey of the adjacent villages near the national park that you're doing your lemur work in, but I want you to go and do this survey And I asked her, well, why? I mean, I'm a scientist. I study lemurs and social groups and their feeding habits. And she said, well, you look Malagasy. You're like the blonde, blue-eyed version of a Malagasy. So I want it'll feel more friendly to folks if you go with a translator. So I did. I went, and I was shocked. I was shocked as a Westerner that I wasn't embraced with open arms, right? That they couldn't understand that specifically the king of this village that I was speaking to felt a little bit hostile at first, because when he saw me, right, the space of this body, he thought that I was a Malagasy who had gone to boarding school and came back and didn't speak Malagasy. And here I was speaking to him in broken French with a translator. When I explained through the translator that I'm actually a New York City kid, and I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm supposed to talk to them about what their feelings are about this national park plan, he disappeared for 20 minutes, came back down with a beautiful shirt, a hat, invited me up to his hut, and therein was my first experience that brought together this idea of otherness, the unknown. In that case, I was the other. You might have thought he was. Otherness, the unknown, and the idea of space that came out of nowhere. Because it turned out we had drawn a circle around where the lemurs lived and called it a national park, right? But there were all these villages and villagers and people who were partaking and living and using, managing these resources for a very, very long time. And I had no idea what it is that they were seeing when they encountered us. And so, of course, when I went back to college after those 4.5 months in the tent, I added a political science and an environmental studies minor to my work, and then I realized I needed to know what the World Bank was, what the IMF was. I had no idea what a structural adjustment program was, and I just sort of woke up, to this idea of colony, of enclosure, of space, and of displacement. So I share that with you to sort of lay the groundwork for what I'm going to say later, that for me, in order to really move forward with environmental justice, we have to think spatially, and we have to think of race as a spatial formation, right? And so we cannot move forward, in my perspective, I make this intervention without thinking of race as a spatial formation, and without thinking of displacement and enclosure as the two key foundations to understanding what we need for justice.
Thank you, Mia. Thank you. Amaya, follow that.
Well, I don't want to follow that. So I think both, like Mindy and Mia, if you are particularly concerned with how to support, in particular, communities of color to create more opportunity for themselves, and you locate your work in that, it is simply impossible not to come up against environmental injustice and work with communities on what it means to create environmental justice. And the reason is that while we typically, and I'm a civil rights attorney by training, right? So I go to law school, I defend people in the AIDS discrimination law clinic who are being discriminated against in terms of their access to health care or being pushed out of housing by virtue of the fact that they have AIDS, which I won't say more about that because I think we already heard from Mindy how that can lead into these questions of environmental justice. I mean, but also Mia's on this issue of space and gentrification and race. And the point is, our communities are all constructed by a series of policies. And our pathways to opportunity or our barriers to them are constructed by policies. And often the policies are invisible to us, but the impacts of them are not. And environmental injustice actually, and especially the way it's racialized, become examples of the impact of those policies. And so if you're a civil rights attorney, as I was, and you're looking at how you deal with these kind of constructs that have either created walls around communities and kept them in, or created walls to keep them out, and we use walls in both ways, metaphorically and physically, and you start to think about how you tear them down, you just keep coming up against the environment in different ways. So the first is obvious, and particularly if you start from a legal framework or a policy framework, you typically start with disparity, right? And so right away, you start to see health disparities that are created because of environmental conditions. When you listen to what the community is trying to work with, so take 75% of all black people in the United States live within 30 miles of a power plant, right? Okay, well, the other thing is you have Manuel Pastor's work that shows, because then people say, oh, well, yeah, but that's just because that's actually not a race problem, that's a poverty problem. Because they just can't afford the housing that's more expensive when there are fewer environmental insults. And that's logical, right? That's logical. Housing values are higher when qualities of a community are better. The problem with that is Manuel Pastor showed in California that actually the environmental insults came to communities of color. The communities of color didn't go to the environmental insults, which actually shifts that whole assumption on its head, right? So I'll fast forward through a variety of work, but just to fast forward to when I was president of the Center for Social Inclusion, as a policy advocacy organization, because again, as I said, I won't do it now, but we could point to policy decisions that created those environmental problems, right? That particularly for communities of color, not only, but particularly. And when you start to then create a policy advocacy organization, as I did, recognizing that the problem I had as a lawyer is that I became a lawyer because I had parents who were civil rights activists, right? And I was not a good organizer. I didn't like knocking on nobody's door I didn't know. That just wasn't who I was. So I was like, but I can argue. And then I found out someone could pay me to argue, and then I got very excited. So, but I guess the point is, though, I thought I was going to be able to be that lawyer who actually supported the organizers, right? And that I would be a tool in the toolbox for those organizers. So very quickly you realize that organizing is disinvested in. The communities of color are not receiving sufficient investments to build up that organizing, which meant when we would come in as attorneys, communities would go, oh, thank God, we can stop now. And it's like, no, you can't stop. We're just creating a tool for you or giving you a hammer. So I sort of switched to policy advocacy and thinking about how do you, as folks that have that kind of policy strategy capacity, help communities of color to create their strategies to create more opportunity and fairness and equity for them. But again, as soon as we started working with communities of color, environment was coming up constantly. But it was coming up in a variety of different ways, and I'll just give you a couple of examples. So in the context of New York City post-September, right, 11th, when all these toxins are raining down as a result of this devastating terror attack on New York City, and you find two things happening. You find, obviously, that, wind is a thing. That's my lesson for you tonight. Wind's a thing. Wind's a thing, and it blows. And so all that toxin blows, right? And it blows all over the dang place. But the policy intervention was to develop a boundary by which the impact of September 11th, including its environmental impacts, were supposed to fall. And those boundaries were Canal Street, down to the southern end of the island, which you might know as the financial district. And then, so it bisected out, put aside that it floated to Brooklyn and the Bronx and the North Jersey and all that, put aside that. It carved out Chinatown and the Lower East Side. They were not in the catchment area of impact. So that's one, right, immediate example. And then the second, very different example, but same thing. We had local leaders, including black elected officials from a rural community outside of Columbia, South Carolina. And I literally heard all these black leaders, including a black elected official, coming to these national meetings with national groups, including some university academic centers, all of us racial justice advocates who were all calling for kind of race and regionalism and these approaches and policy strategies around regionalism. And he came and he said, what you're saying makes absolutely no sense for my community. Because we were talking about housing mobility strategies and investment in public transit, and we were like, why? These are so smart because we've researched it. And he was like, well, first of all, you're assuming that black people don't own anything, and 72% of my community owns its land. Because during the Civil War, when the Union armies came down and started displacing plantation owners, they created policy. They just started divvying up land and handing it to slaves. But that means you have home ownership in this rural area that is all black that's existed for, okay, you all can do the math. So that whole assumption, set of policy interventions and assumptions did not fit the community. And the second thing they said is what we want is economic development for our community. And if we have the one asset we're always talking about black people not having, which is land ownership, then why can't we get into this renewable energy economy? So even when it's not coming as so we typically think of environment and communities of color thinking in terms of insults, environmental insults and environmental impacts. Here was an example of communities of color trying to figure out how can we innovate, like how can we create more opportunity for ourselves in our community, which is also a very different lens than we were typically using the, how do we help people who get excluded from these kinds of opportunities, not what opportunities do people already have in their community and how do we support them to maximize it. But the point is in either instance, communities of color were not coming to us in an issue vacuum, right, or with a single issue. They were coming wanting to be innovators, and they were coming also recognizing the ways in which they were being artificially cut out of the policy reforms that were being proposed and ignored in the context of the environment. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Anna.
Wow. Amazing hearing everyone reflect on EJ and their work. It's amazing. So I feel like I've kind of grown up with EJ. As EJ has evolved, so has my professional and approach to environmental justice. I grew up in Newark in a place called Ironbound that had very distinct boundaries, right? And they call it Ironbound because it's surrounded by rail. And the city of Newark itself, even as a community, a city that has 85% of the city of Newark is people of color, even within the city of Newark, highly segregated. So the county is segregated, the city is hyper-segregated. And I was an immigrant kid in the city, and I went to a school that was 95% black. Went to a school that was 95% black. I didn't speak English. So I got a very different introduction to America than I think lots of other kids did. And what I grew up with was always a sense of, why is it like this? Why is the space organized like this? Why have we organized our communities like this? And all around us, there were insults. There were, you walked outside your door and you could taste the air. I mean, you could smell the sewage. You could smell and see the air pollution. The incinerator was, a couple of blocks from my home. So that was just a normal part of life. And even today, my family still has their house in the same place right across the street from the local elementary school. And it's still very much every day when I bring people there, the first thing they notice is the airplanes. You have to stop every 3 minutes. So imagine I went to school in a school that was 160 years old. It's still standing. The kids are still going there. And every 3 to 5 minutes, we would stop from jets flying overhead. That still goes on today. And you can't open and close the windows because of, anyway. So it's an everyday thing, and you just accepted it. It became background noise, along with all the other issues that people were dealing with, and mostly with trying to survive and put food on the table and make it through. And my parents, their goal was, you're an immigrant kid, so like your goal should be get out. Go to school, get an education and get out. And so that's what I thought I wanted. And but in the meantime, what they didn't see, they accidentally got me involved in protest and resistance, which sort of backfired on them. And so, when the People of Color Summit was happening, I was in high school. And I was really angry. I was a very angry teenager, and I was like, I can't believe this. Look at what they're doing to our community. They're dumping on us. Mm-hmm. And my parents were really involved in the protest movements at the time, protesting waste incineration, tire incineration, sewage sludge incineration, everything you can imagine you can burn or make or bury. They were trying to do it in the city of Newark. And so, that was my first introduction to this thing called environmental justice, which I didn't know it was called that, and protesting and getting involved and feeling empowered for the first time and not just angry about it. And I thought, I'll be a scientist. Is that, scientists have power. They have special language that they use that's code that nobody else knows. I, like you, went to the jungles of Costa Rica and studied, and then, I had the same epiphany that, oh my God, they don't actually talk to anyone in Costa Rica. They just study the wildlife. And I said, I can't do that. I want to go back to my community. I want to give back and study urban systems, urban planning. And so I went back home, actually, to do my PhD, and it was a wonderful gift. My parents thought I was crazy. They're like, you're coming back? So I was, doing my PhD and got back into the work of community building. And really that's how I saw the evolution of the movement, too, the EJ movement, from just protesting. And when it wasn't just protest, resistance was really important because it was also a way to be heard, to be seen, to be recognized as dignified human beings in dignified places. Because a lot of the dumping that happens is also a stigmatization, as saying you are less than. Your community is not as valued as other communities. You're invisible. Our community was always the place that's somewhere else. It's where the something else goes. It's where your trash goes. It's where your sewage goes. It's where everything that you don't want goes. And that's also where the people go that you don't want. Prisons, people of color, public housing, that's what all the stuff that goes to the margins. And so resistance was a form of also of self-determination and of self-recognition. But it was like, how do we go from just fighting all the time what we don't want to having a vision for what we do want and really actively and affirmatively building that for ourselves rather than waiting for someone to come and do it for us, or even just continuing the struggle to just resist. So when I came back to the community, I saw that evolution. I saw that EJ was building a movement of political organizing and community organizing that was based on planning and envisioning what we wanted. What does our future look like? How do we build it from where we are? And that was really rewarding because I got to see firsthand the value of community innovation. Even though it was at a small scale, it was like people testing things out, taking risks, seeing, how can they not just deal with environmental regulations. I learned in school all these are the environmental regs, what are the policies? That's how I met Michelle, actually. I interviewed Michelle. She was at the first environmental justice director in the state of New Jersey. And I made
It was a rough interview.
I made a beeline straight for her. I'm like, you're gonna create a law and it's gonna solve EJ issues in New Jersey. And she was wise enough to tell me that was never gonna happen with just one law. And the community work has evolved, so it's really turned into a much richer, I think, more comprehensive and holistic view of what it's going to take to deal with structural injustice. It's not just going to be an environmental law. It's going to take a lot more work in lots of different sectors to develop and to undo the issues that many of these ladies here have spoken about, the housing issues, the segregation in our cities, the complete collapse of our institutions in our cities and disinvestment. And how do you rebuild that systemically? How do you do it? And from my personal research, and I'm actually a practitioner, I'm a professor of practice, so I have the ability and privilege to also continue to try to do the work in Newark and also through collaborations with networks around the country, which is also a new thing. When I started out, there was all these pockets of people doing little things, but now there's national and transnational networks and solidarity networks that are innovating and they're sharing and they're creating models for how you do that work. And so I'm really invested right now in still building community development, community work in Newark, and also looking at models for how we can support that same kind of building in communities around the country and sometimes in solidarity, people in other parts of the world. Yeah.
Well, Thank you, ladies. Let's unpack that a little bit. I'll start with Anna and then come back down. We've come a long way from the letter to the Green Group, and I think it was in the early 90s when the environmental justice community held them to task, the big environmental groups held them to task to say, you're not addressing issues of environment and people. Remember that the Environmental Protection Agency actually protects human health and the environment. So it's both. They created a federal agency, a bipartisan creation of the Environmental Protection Agency to do both. Yet there was this recognition by the environmental justice community that the larger resourced institutions weren't doing so. So Anna, since we're with you, can you talk a little bit about some of the changes that you've seen in the arc from those days and that you're talking about with frontline communities over the past 20, 25 years to strategies that they're employing now, for instance, with the bee and other approaches?
So in 1994, when the federal executive order on environmental justice was signed by Bill Clinton, some of you are too young to even remember Bill Clinton, right? He signed this executive order on environmental justice, which still stands today. There were 4 states that had explicit environmental justice policies in the country. As of 2015, all 50 states have some version of an environmental justice policy. And you would think that's a huge victory we would be celebrating, except for the fact that if you really look at what these environmental justice policies do, what the substance of them is, what's the actual output of them, it's very little in terms of what you see on the ground. A lot of it is symbolic. We recognize that this is a problem, check. The EPA released their environmental justice screening tool, and it says, look, it's very obvious. You're a person of color, you're going to be living in a community with pollution. And it's actually, even further than that, it's actually going to determine how many years you live and your health impacts, which is a terrifying thing for all of us. It should be terrifying for all of us that this is the reality that we live in. But the policies don't get us much past the procedure, but much past the recognition. A lot of it never got to the point of dealing with distributive justice, the spatial aspects, the systemic aspects of injustice, and it stayed very narrowly within the reign of the environment, which I think both for the movement and for policy is not adequate anymore. So, the best examples that I've seen since then of trying to break out of that box are states that have tied environmental justice and climate justice to economic policies, housing policies, transportation and public sector investments, where they're getting really creative about how do we drive investment, how do we open up opportunities and access in a different way, not just narrowly within the realm of the environmental regulations. And I'll just say, even within the realm of environmental regulations, we haven't made very big strides, because to this day, if a company comes to the city of Newark, like, for example, the Hess Corporation, and they want to build a huge mega plant, they will get their permit, and they do, and they did. They still to this day get their permit. Even though we know all this data and all this science, and even though we have an environmental justice policy on the books, there's still not an affirmative stance on disproportionate impact, regardless of intent, means you can't do that anymore. So we still have a long way to go. And like I said, I think there's a bill in New York State right now that got passed, the New York Renews bill, that is, I think, a really good example of doing this affirmatively, saying we have environmental justice communities, and that means we're going to invest in those communities.
Well, Maya, I wanted to ask you to go a little deeper in this from where you just most recently sat also in the mayor's office, and at the right hand of the mayor. Was it the left hand? I don't know.
I like to say that was the left.
Left. And just in terms of when we're thinking about public policies or legislation that go not necessarily deeper, but more broadly in the public policy spectrum that's necessary for us to achieve the intersections on the structural side of environmental justice. What are some of your thoughts there?
Yeah, and I'm gonna. I don't know that I can fully answer this question because it's such a big one, but I'll start again by story. So when that black community I talked about in Lower Richland, South Carolina, that owned land and said, stop telling us about all these race and regionalism policies that don't make any sense to us, help us figure out how, and a lot of their fights started with the policies around zoning, right, and how they were being down-zoned. So anyway, I won't go into the details, but the point is there were policy fights around rural planning and zoning that was going to impact their ability to make the use of their land for innovation and getting into a renewable energy economy, right? Which was their vision, was that they could remain on their land and keep their land, but make use of their land in a way that could get them out of poverty. So when we started looking, we said, okay, we have no clue. We have no clue how to do what you're talking about. But we'll go find some folks that do, because somebody does, and we'll just put you in touch with them. But we'll give you an analysis on the zoning side of it. But beyond that, we'll just try to help you find partners. And there's some brilliant people out there who are doing brilliant thinking on cooperatives and how you create a cooperative, and that was great. A cooperative for what? In renewable energy when you own land, and what are the policies that actually help you turn that land or even create that cooperative in something that has impact? So it became pretty quickly apparent that we weren't just going to go pair them with someone to help them become innovators in an economy that was sustainable and help them have more opportunity in their community. Because they were just big unanswered questions. People didn't have the answer. So we decided to pull together a brain trust of thinkers to say, how do we help communities innovate in this space and actually become owners in an economy that is environmentally sustainable, and then from our end think about the policies that help that happen, right, and create the pathways for that to happen. So we pulled together this brain trust of very, very smart people, one of whom is a wonderful local developer, really triple bottom line, really thinks about how you build community and fairness. He's a black developer here in Manhattan, but also from Jackson, Mississippi, who's Carlton Brown, who said, okay, but I have this guy you have to include on this brain trust. And, it's like Bruce Lincoln. And I was like, I don't know who the heck Bruce Lincoln is. He's like, he's a technology engineer. And I was like, I don't know what that is. But you're Carlton Brown, so if you tell me he has to be on, he can be on. I'll let your friends on. So I added Bruce Lincoln. Bruce Lincoln comes to our first brain trust meeting, and I got Manuel Pastor agreeing to be on. I got all these big thinkers, right? And the first meeting, Bruce Lincoln comes, who's from Harlem. And we talk for about an hour, and we're posing what the problem is for this black community in Lower Richland and how this should be a model. And could we think about ways for them to create a geothermal plant on their land that could be community owned, blah, blah, blah. And at the end of this meeting, at the end of the hour, Bruce Lincoln has not said a word. He stands up and says, I gotta go. But before I go, I just want to say one thing. Y'all can't do any of that shit without broadband. And then he left. And I just went, okay, so we're structuralists, right? So we're like, if you tell us that, we have no idea what it means, but we're going to tell you. But it didn't take long to dig underneath what he was saying and realize all our great ideas were absolutely meaningless without broadband. And guess what? Communities of color don't have broadband. So, and it's on so many different levels that you need to innovate. I mean, not even just in the narrow sense of it. Environment's not narrow, but even in just the specific sense of the kinds of things we were thinking about, but in all kinds of ways. So it just became really apparent that if we weren't focused on an infrastructure development and investment and who gets it is all policy driven. It's all policy driven. And if anyone, so I mean, I just think to Anna's point about this notion of going beyond regulatory, but actually think about how policy actually creates investment, a lot of it is policy driven. And so a lot of what we started to think about was, well, then what kind of policies do we need in the broadband space that then will enable communities to be able to be innovative on all the things they have to be able to transact in and interact in and to engage in. And so let me just say a couple more things about why this is important beyond the obvious example of you can't have a geothermal plant without broadband, because that's pretty clear. But even when we're looking at these innovations, like folks were, there's this great project that came, that the Economic Development Corporation of New York City, I sat on there on the selection panel for apps, app development, and these really cool apps. And they had to be, they had to add value to people's lives, right? And so this phenomenally interesting app that was one of the winners the year I sat on the panel was HeatSeek. Right? So HeatSeek is this like sensor that you can really cheaply put in your apartment that can then help track whether your landlord is freezing you out of your apartment, right? Which is a big problem for low-income communities. So I use this example because in the absence of communities having their own broadband, all the applications and information and data they can derive from this for a whole next level, including for NYCHA, for public housing, their ability to think about not just their efficiency, their energy efficiency as public housing, but how they can actually turn that efficiency into a lot more social investments for their community, right? But you can't do any of that without the broadband. So I say that to say infrastructure. A lot of what we're talking about, if we talk, it's not just redistribution. And I think one of the things we on the left have to think about really actively, because we like to think about redistributive models, it's not just redistribution, it's how do we create the policies that enable communities to innovate, to create their own generation of value and resources that go beyond their communities. And that's not redistribution, that's generation.
Thank you. Mia. Now you get to follow. All right. But I would love to hear a little bit about how you can riff on what Maya was just saying in terms of thinking about reassembling people, place, and land to be able to combat some of these structural issues that we have and to bring relationships together that can actually help us finally achieve environmental justice.
So here's the thing. I believe strongly in public policy. You need it. You need procedural justice, you need distributive justice. Not only do you need left of left lawyers, you need public policy advocates who are willing to go deep and long and really put themselves on the line. It's a tough job. But I want to talk about something a little bit different, just to add a bit of a different flavor to the panel. So I've come recently to own the fact that I love theory. And it's like a joke, An academic walks in the room and they're going to start talking about theory and everyone wants to leave the room. But I've started to own this, and why? Why have I started to own this? Some of my students are in the room, and I talk a lot about theory. What is your theory? What is your epistemological framework? What's your conceptual framework? I see some students here. Don't roll your eyes. Theory is how you know what you know. How do you know what you know? Okay? And this is so critical. It presages policy. I guess that's an intervention I'm willing to make. How do you know what you know? What is a theory of space for you, or a theory of justice, or a theory of environmental justice, for example? I'm going to try to walk you through one of my professional chapters. Before I went to MIT for my doctoral degree, I was a program officer at the Ms. Foundation, and Katrina happened, and I was sent down to Mississippi because everybody was going to Louisiana. And I have some family in Mississippi, so it made sense for me to go to Mississippi. And, you know, after many, many dozens and dozens of trips and lots of deep learning, one of the things that struck me was that my home institution, which was the Ms. Foundation for Women, I worked with wonderful women there, required me to very succinctly and strategically and repeatedly make the argument that my wanting to support the development of what then was called a Black community land trust was in fact a feminist intervention. That it did represent the goals and aspirations and missions of such a important organization like the Ms. Foundation for Women. And I believe I was able to make that argument. And this is the way that I was able to make this argument. And it kind of goes to this idea of how do you know what you know, theory. How do you know what you know? So when I went down to Mississippi, one of the first people I met was a woman named Rose Johnson, okay? She assessed me, I assessed her. We tried to get to know each other. Over time, she would invite me to fish fries. She would invite me to watershed trainings at the church. She would invite me to meet community-based folks, and never laying out right away, here's what you should write in your grant report for the top dogs at the Ms. Foundation. Laying out for me how the people there knew what they knew, okay? So, you know, this is the Turkey Creek community. It's a couple of centuries old community that was settled by emancipated slaves. It's a Black community that has dealt with flooding again and again. And of course, when Katrina happened, there was terrible flooding. There's a deep environmental justice issues that go all throughout the community, but in particular, this one water space called Turkey Creek. Turkey Creek is where people were baptized. Turkey Creek is near where people picked blackberries. Turkey Creek is where people went fishing. Turkey Creek is how people understood the demarcation of where space was safe for Black people away from white people. Turkey Creek was a natural demarcation, right? Rose explained to me through stories and through these relationships, meeting people again and again. I mean, again and again. I'm talking about, door to door to, you know, she was hazing me in a way, right? She was teaching me to know what I know through her eyes. That the idea of land for this community was deeply historical and deeply racialized, and there was no disaggregating the cleaning up of the creek from the protection of this idea of Black space and Black people. You could not pull those things out from each other. Now having a PhD, I understand, you know, very smart people refer to this as critical race theory. You know, Rose Johnson was not conceptualizing it that way. She was talking to me through people, through stories, so that I could know what I knew through the land via the people. She wanted me to know Turkey Creek as a space that was polluted, but that people were baptized in, right? That this is a sacred space because emancipated people settled there because they felt safe from white terror at the time, right? So the reason I bring this up is because when we think about theory, this is not the kind of stuff that we usually think about, right? We start to think about Foucault or Bourdieu or so whatever it is, and we say that, well, theory is totally divorced from what's going on the ground. But I want to reintroduce to you that theory is trying to explain the world, trying to explain what we see and how people know what they know, right? Now, in the context of environmental justice, we've had many stories and many theories of space. The theory of a lack of distributive justice, right? The theory of a lack of juridical justice, right? Or procedural justice, right? But I think we need to back up a little bit and think much bigger and almost more bland about what is your theory of space? What is your theory of space? And we can start right here in the United States, since I'm American, and many of you may be American. What is an American theory of space? Because I think if we antagonize each other enough and come up with a shared idea of space in the United States, we'll get ourselves not only meeting maybe justice, but going way past it and confronting problems we never even noticed in front of us, right? So here is one of the books that I brought. I was told to bring books. I was going to bring more, but I have a bad back. This is the one of the latest, kind of flashy books. This individual, Sven Beckert at Harvard, is not the first to theorize cotton, right? But this is one of the most famous books in the New York Times, etc. So you should pick it up. And why is this? I'm not getting paid to shill for this book, but it's a great book. It's a great book. Why is this so important? Does Mr. Beckert talk about the 3 pillars of white supremacy in his book? No. When I was reading his book, though, with my critical race theory stuff, I saw it all over his book. And it occurred to me that this Harvard dude, this is a very respected person, it's a beautifully written book, you should pick it up, right? Was talking in a way, he was improving a literacy of space, a theory of space, in a way that many people could hear it. He calls this Empire of Cotton, a global history. Now, why would cotton? I choose this book of all the books in my bookshelf to bring to you, to begin a conversation of the theory of space in the United States. Why is cotton so important? Why is cotton so central? Right? It is so central because it immediately brings you face to face with plantation slavery, with monocrop agriculture, with displacement of people and nature, and with enclosure, right? The first mortgage was on a human body so that cotton could be subsidized, right? The idea of property as so central in a theory of space for the United States begins with cotton. Now, you might say to yourself, what is she talking about? I thought we were here to talk about environmental justice. We are. We are here to talk about environmental justice. Environmental justice is a symptom. It's a symptom of our refusal to really face our lack of a theory of space in the United States. It's a symptom. It's a symptom. Now, you know the game whack-a-mole, right? It's endless, right? So there will be, I know now I sound like an Afro-pessimist here, but I love James Baldwin. I hope everyone here does too. Anyway, there are endless environmental injustices that we will face, endless. But the only way to begin to transform how we understand the problem, right, is to each of us develop a theory of space that begins at some jargon-free, very personal set of reflections and realizations. So when I read Sven Beckert, I thought to myself, well, this is a blues epistemology. Well, of course, he doesn't call it that. The person, Clyde Woods, the late and great radical geographer Clyde Woods, coined this concept, blues epistemology. I had the honor of sitting in his office in the Black Studies Department in my most recent position. And he called this need for us to understand space through institutions and history, right, a blues epistemology. And so I guess what I want all that to say is, in the spirit of Clyde, in the spirit of deep American history, we need a blues epistemology for understanding space. Blues meaning playful, improvisational, meaning sonic, but traveling across time and space, and epistemology how you know what you know. How you know what you know. So we'll always need public policy and champions and lions who will fight the good fight. But if each of us does not have a blues epistemology, we will defer to others to fight those fights, right? We will defer and expect that other people fight those fights. And we will expect not to have a conversation about a theory of space with folks like my mother, right? Who's a Korean immigrant who would feel completely out of place here. But if I talk to her about cotton and the history of the United States, she could connect that back to being a farm girl in Korea, right? She could think about empire and Japan and the history of Japan and Korea. Anyway, so I really could go on and on, but I'll let Mindy go.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Mia. Mindy, just taking that all in context and what Mia just shared with us and the work that you have done and the books that you have written about the intersection of trauma and displacement with communities of color in this country. Can you now help us understand more about how that intersects with environmental justice from where you sit, your research, your scholarship?
Could I say no? And then,
Okay, there we go.
there we go.
Talk about whatever you want to talk about.
It's funny how this is getting bigger and bigger, right? Because now we're at Cotton, a global history. That's awesome. I'm not sure if we don't have a theory of space in the United States, but if we might not have a theory, but we certainly have a practice. And our practice is what I've come to call the redlining paradigm. So all of you have heard of redlining, right? Yeah. So the thing about redlining and what you have to do and what we have to make part of our teaching is that you have to actually read the survey documents. There are like 237 redlining maps. It's one of those great criminal injustices that they're not yet all on the internet. I mean, it's just absurd, 237 maps. And each has a couple hundred supporting documents. How long would it take the United States government to digitize this? A minute. And why doesn't the United States government, even headed by President Barack Obama, do this? I believe that one of the reasons they don't do it is because these are the most fundamental documents for understanding the operation of race and space in the United States. When you read these documents, so literally they had a survey. So when you do survey research, you have to ask a very specific question. And you send somebody out into the field and they have to ask exactly that question. Or they have to find that information. So one of the questions is infiltration of. So last time you were renting an apartment, did you think of yourself as infiltrating? Last time you were on a spy mission, did you think of yourself as infiltrating? Infiltration is not something people do when they're house hunting. They're just looking for a place to live. So another word that you frequently see in these is encroachment. Encroachment. Have you thought of yourself as encroaching when you went to live in a neighborhood? Really, we don't think of house hunting as either infiltration or encroachment. These surveys are about infiltration and encroachment because what they thought was desirable was homogeneous neighborhoods, and in particular, white neighborhoods had to be protected from undesirable racial elements, which is all of us, and probably pretty much all of you. And if we were moving in, then there was infiltration and encroachment. That's literally what the surveys are about. And then they rank the neighborhoods. So at the top, you have places that are green, which means they were new buildings, white people, and good restrictive covenants to keep the undesirable racial elements out. This is a very explicit statement. Whether we, maybe we don't want to call it a theory, but this is the practice. This is the redlining paradigm. If you look at what's happening in the United States, let's just say New York City, what's happening, you will, just for example, look at where they are putting up buildings. And for whom are they putting up buildings? You will find that they are putting up buildings in places that they have declared green. Meaning, they're for white people, these are all arbitrary terms. So whoever they consider white. Nothing to do with skin color. It's just whatever they think of as desirable elements. Who are the people that are desirable? They're putting up buildings for those people, and they have restrictive covenants. The most powerful restrictive covenant at this point is money. So where there are neighborhoods that are red, meaning the neighborhoods where poor people live, the undesirable elements, undesirable people, there are no new buildings going up in those places. If there are new buildings going up, it signals that those people are about to be pushed out, because part of the process is ethnic cleansing. So I believe we do have a very active practice. It's a very unstable practice. It is constantly sorting by race and by class, following the rules of the redlining paradigm. And the most important thing you can do in the course of your education is look at those 237 maps and look at the supporting documents and become familiar with the practice of race and space, because it's governing your life and my life and the life of all of us. It is the fundamental environmental injustice that is being constantly played out. Now, how do we therefore step back and say, look at what does this do to society? This creates trauma. If you're going to push people out of their neighborhoods, it's going to create trauma. Anybody who lived in Harlem and has seen their neighborhood be transformed from an African American neighborhood to a different neighborhood, how are they feeling about that? What's going on in Fort Greene and Bedford-Stuyvesant, and what do people have to say about that? These are terribly traumatic experiences, but they're built on other previously traumatic experiences. Black people used to live where Lincoln Center is, and Puerto Rican people and poor Irish people, and they all got pushed out. So it's one after another, cumulatively, synergistically destroying communities, which people try desperately to rebuild, but then they destroy them again. So not only is it trauma in the present moment that's happening to communities, but it's built on other traumas. So the assignment, I would say, which perhaps you would agree with, but perhaps not, is that we really do need to imagine what's the paradigm that we want. Can we extract ourselves from the redlining paradigm as what's governing the history of our nation, and a paradigm that is founded in abusive plantation agriculture that was ecologically destructive of people, place, of the globe? Can we emerge from that kind of ecological self-mutilation as a way to govern space, and think of something that's inclusive and democratic and fun? Can we imagine that? And I completely agree with Mia that we've got to imagine this new way of how we're going to live together. And part of it is around, as Maya said, can you have a black land cooperative or whatever? People own land. How are people going to own the land? We've got to think about how people are going to own the land, because under conditions of the hyper-commodification of the land, we destroy people's habitat, where people live. We have to live in communities, because that's our DNA. If we can't live in healthy communities, we can't be healthy. So hyper-commodification of the land is completely inimical with long-term sustainability of the earth, of the planet, certainly for our species. So what's the new imagination? That's your job. That's why you came to the New School, because you know yourselves to be that kind of people who are going to imagine a better future. That's really why you're here. And so now that we've given you your homework assignment, we would like it tomorrow.
Well, does anyone have anything they want to add on that strain? Go ahead.
Well, I want to add something that I think, and particularly in a place like the New School, we have the incredible ability to think about, and that we need to think about more, which is what it means to govern. Because having been, for the first time, on that governing side of the fence, I have to say that some of the ways we have these conversations, which I have philosophical resonance with, and certainly from a value standpoint, I think sometimes we don't recognize what we're missing in terms of the structural challenges that even folks who are within governing structures, despite what they're trying to do, what gets in their way. And the reason this is important is for all the reasons we've already heard on the panel. But I just want to throw out one specific example, because I think Mindy's work is so important on this notion, and Mia's as well, and Anna's, but I'm just pulling out this notion of space and segregation and the trauma that is caused by it. What happens when you're on the governing side, though, and this is, I'm thinking very much and specifically about this point about, green buildings and desirability and the restrictive covenant being money. Which is, there's no question that there's a fundamental affordability problem, and it's not just in New York City, it's actually all over the country. And we see, Dominican population from northern Manhattan moving to central rural Pennsylvania, right, because of housing costs, and Latinos in Williamsburg getting pushed out into northern Long Island, and right, so this is that kind of displacement. But if you're governing and you have to create the models of how you are trying to fix it, and in this context, in the de Blasio administration, trying to fix it by preserving affordable units and creating more units of affordable housing, put the definition aside for right now, in communities that are gentrifying in order to help people stay, right? That the notion is if you can preserve those units and create more affordable housing in those communities, like Bed-Stuy, which is actually one of the neighborhoods, like East New York, like a bunch of these communities, what you're going to do is help people stay, right? And not just have exclusionary, gentrification is not really the problem, because we all want to be middle class, at least. It's exclusive, meaning it's like only certain people get to gentrify, right? But the reason I raise this is because the real problem is what you hit up against is if the federal government isn't creating investments that cities can use, and cities have to rely on the private sector business models to get it done because they don't have the money. So what you do is you create rezoning and attempts to incentivize the private market to create the housing. And then you get sued for the civil rights violations because, then you're preserving segregation. So the only reason I'm lifting this up is because some of you, I hope, will go into government service, because unless we have folks like us in government service doing that work, we will never create these solutions. I mean, that's part of it. Also the private sector, to create more different kinds of business models so that folks in the public sector aren't stuck with bad business models when they're looking for private partnership. But the other then is for those of us who don't do either, who stay in the advocacy side, is to recognize that some of our allies are stuck with some really bad structural arrangements and trying to do the best they can, and we're not always making the right arguments to support the kind of change we need, and we need to own that, and we need to own it more aggressively.
So I guess what I want to say is what I hope a good amount of you go into government. I really do. My first internship after college was at the Environmental Protection Agency in DC, and I worked in the Office of Air and Radiation, and it was a slog, but it was awesome, and I learned a lot. And there are some very special people there. I was the assistant to the science policy advisor, whatever. But I also hope that more of you, I hope I don't get in trouble for saying this, I hope more of you tap into your anarchistic, revolutionary impulse and figure out how you can, on your own, without any institution or policy or leadership or anything like that, decentralize your own vision for your theory of space and do something spatial such that you are resisting on a spatial level. What would that look like? You're like, what the hell did she just say? So an example would be, for instance, I told you I'm a little bit of a maverick, so one of the things that really pisses me off is I know a lot about housing finance. There was no 30-year mortgage before we decided to racialize space, literally through the 30-year mortgage, and we created all this redlining, absolutely. So it's a racket. It's a racket. The whole home ownership situation is a racket. But you know why many of us buy into it? Because we feel like, well, there are winners and losers in life, dude. There are winners and losers. There are virtuous losers. and you just have to try not to be one of them. So what you need to do is go to a great school, get yourself your degree, and put in your time, pay off your loans, and do your thing, and tread water, and be middle class, or at least front like you're middle class, okay? Or you can own the horror of this debt society and do something to resist it, even if it feels and sounds stupid and uncertain and completely without an end point, such as, why is it that there's basically 1, 2, 3 ways for most of us to imagine home ownership? Now, I'm not talking about the focus of my dissertation, which was community land trust home ownership. I'm talking about literally the structure of it, the frame of it, the literal building of it. Why is it that most people in this room would never even consider building your own home? I know, because you're saying, well, because I don't know how to build a home. Why don't you know how to build a home? Actually, did you know that you could build a home? I could train you. You could take I'm doing a practicum on cob and mud and hemp building in a couple of months through TEDC. They may not know about it, but Molly knows about it. I could train you how to build a home on a suburban lot for, I don't know, $1,500. And it would be fireproof, earthquake proof, and it would have an R insulation of 60, meaning you would barely need to use heat. And no, I'm not full of it.
Sold.
The question, though, would be, are you willing to get in trouble? Because you would get in trouble depending on where you built it.
So where are you building yours?
Right.
I'll tell you where I'm building mine. I am moving I'm living in South Orange. I'm not in Brooklyn anymore, but it's New Jersey, and we're buying a house, and in the back, I'm building this structure, this home. And eventually, I would like, my husband doesn't know this yet, he will now, because he's watching me, hi honey. We are gonna move into the cob structure and then rent out the actual house as a community space, so.
You are starting a movement, Mia. Yes.
How are each of you gonna imagine a whole new way to do something like, and I know it sounds crazy, Harvard had a whole symposium on mud. If Harvard thinks it's actually so, in Ireland, there are structures 500 years old made of this material that are still up.
Great
Okay.
Zimbabwe.
All over the world.
All over the
So that's not
world.
mud, that's
But
stone.
you guys are, not you guys, are paying housing developers, $400,000, $500,000 to put up these matchstick homes that would burn up in flames in a matter of 20 minutes. Anyway, that's all I have to say.
I want to get a couple more questions in, a little bit of a round robin. No, it's right. This is this is the point we want to get to when we're having an opportunity to be able to engage with what each is saying. And I have to open up for questions
Yes.
in a minute. But let me ask one question. 5 minutes and 27 seconds. Does anyone know the significance of that portion of time? That is the amount of time that was dedicated to issues of environment or climate at the 3 presidential debates that we were treated to. And so that really, as I was watching all of them and waiting for many issues that are important to me in terms of equity and race and structural policy issues, all I got was 5 minutes and 27 seconds. So I raise this to say to our panelists, we have a job to do, right? I mean, we are here at a leading university. We have hearts and minds and of amazing students. We have faculty where we can engage with. We have the Tishman Center. We have a lot of support to do it. What should we be doing, universities like the New School, faculty like ourselves, students that are here, alumni, I know there's a lot of alumni in the audience, what should we be doing to really elevate this discourse, elevate the solutions, elevate the opportunities, to get people talking about the theories and the principles combined with the principles of environmental justice. What can or should we be doing? So I open that up, and anybody, the first person that wants to speak, just go ahead and
Don't vote
jump
for
in.
Donald Trump, who said that climate change is a Chinese hoax.
What?
All right, I'm being flippant.
That's real.
That's why I wasn't so unhappy that it wasn't more than 5 minutes and 20 seconds, given what the quality of the conversation would have been.
I know. Anna?
I'll just say, well, if you want, the debates are not where it's at. And I think a lot of our students already feel plugged in some way, you know. That's why many of you are here as part of this community. So I feel like our mission is really not just to see climate change or, you know, economic justice or other issues as sort of standalone, out there, abstract ideas, but as ideas that people are living and expressing every day and feeling like they're part of a community. I think every student here, I was learning these ideas of from my Native American friends around decolonizing the way we think about our research and the way we think about our work as students, as academicians, as professionals when you go into whatever field you go into, and not always atomizing everything. That it's all about the individual in this rat race of capitalism to get and accumulate and extract as much as we can. And you see that in academia too. It's like the extraction of knowledge, sort of everything is very individualized. And I hope that if we're really going to do anything on climate change, if we're really going to do anything on these issues of racial and economic justice, we have to see ourselves as part of a collective again, and seeing the solutions as part of collectives. So this idea of belonging, that you can enact things individually and feel empowered and feel part of an arc and of your own stories. How are you connected to your place in your space, and how are you connecting back to it? But also how you're connecting to this community of people and community of institutions and organizations that are mobilizing, that are actively struggling, that are actively innovating, and there's so much richness out there. You know, forget the debates. That's like a brain drain. The action is really, to me, and I have a bias, is at the front lines. You know, everybody's captivated with, Standing Rock, what's happening at Standing Rock, those points of resistance and blockade, but those are happening all over the world, and probably in your communities where you come from or where you're living now, that's happening. There's some form of resistance, there's some form of innovation happening. So I really want to encourage students to find those places, find the front lines, listen to those stories, and connect to some kind of collective action and collective movement in solidarity and mutuality. Because I think as long as we're kept in these little individual boxes where we're just making money and accumulating things and extracting things and increasing our own privilege, then we define success in the way that the dominant discourse defines success, which is to continue to propagate injustice. But if we can, again, reimagine what that could look like, what does a regenerative economy look like, and how am I part of that? And who are the communities all over the country that are doing that? There are actually communities doing that work in South Carolina, all over the country and the world, and how do I become part of that, or generate that in my own community? So there's lots of places we can give you resources to look for those places, but connect.
Why don't you throw out a few of those resources? And then
Some of them are on this list. Some of them are right here in New York City. There's the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. There's the Climate Justice Alliance, which is national and international, the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance. There's an initiative called the Building Equity and Alignment, which is a network of both grassroots, frontline communities, and green groups, environmental groups working on, again, aligning the idea of justice and climate justice. And there's some great, not just case studies, but there's things going on right here in communities like there's a cooperative green utility happening in Brooklyn where communities like organized by Uprose, are actually thinking about not only how we're going to get renewable energy and efficiency in our homes and in our apartments, but how are we going to own the systems of production and energy? How are we going to redefine how we consume energy in our homes? And how cooperative cleaning enterprises, land trusts, it's just like in like a 20-mile radius. So there's a lot of really exciting things happening. So there's no excuse not to be involved.
But I would just like to add that in addition to getting involved in sort of direct action and knowing what's going on, that one of the direct actions that we take as academics is to broaden our understanding of the problems. That our history has been, and our stories and our thinking has been hidden from us. I'm very impressed by the experience at Georgetown, because when I was growing up, the idea that you got sold down the river meant that you were forever disconnected from your family. And it was a black box. The idea that Georgetown sold slaves down the river, but actually found them again and is reconnecting them to their past just blows my mind. There's so much history that the whole history of slavery has largely been hidden from us. And just think about, the idea that Birth of a Nation is a movie now. There's so much to discover, and in discovering it, we have a better understanding, and we can make better decisions. It's not that the book of answers has been written, and therefore this process of discovery is part of it, and in the most dialectical way possible to take what we do as scholars and academics and be connected with what people are doing in communities, and to go back and forth between those poles. But to bring our unique contribution, which is the parts of an epistemology really of poor people, working people, people of color, what are the knowledges that we ought to be bringing to bear on these problems? And that's really sacred work as well.
Mindy, can you mention the project that you are bringing to the New School community?
Why, I would love to. So Empire of Cotton brings us right back to African enslavement. So 1619 is when the first Africans arrived in Jamestown. One day, a reporter called me up and said that she was worried about the children in Flint would be traumatized because they had been betrayed by their government. And I was like, well, actually, that's happened before. And I was like, think about 1620 or whenever those first Africans arrived, but I couldn't remember the date. So I looked it up, and when I saw it was 1619, I was like, wait, that's 500 years ago, because I'm bad at math. And so then somebody's like, no, it's 400 years ago. I was like, is 400 years like a long enough time that we should worry about it? And then I was like, actually 400 years is a pretty long time too. So therefore, one of the things as a psychiatrist I believe is that anniversaries are important. And so 2019 will be 400 years since those Africans arrived in Jamestown and were sold into bondage. And how do you commemorate such an event? And what should that be about? What's the process of discovery? What are the events? And then how can the New School be a place that calls the world to this commemoration? So that's my project. If anybody wants to help, let me know.
I have a resource. Can I?
Please, go ahead, Mia, and then we're going to open it up.
Okay. I think a lot about white supremacy. Again, it's not about white people, about systems, and race as a system. So if you guys are interested in reading more about it, and again, it's this 3 pillars. Slavery / capitalism is one pillar, another is genocide, colonialism, and then another is Orientalism and war. These 3 pillars are how we understand white supremacy. Go to loveharder.files.wordpress.com. Again, loveharder.files.wordpress.com. And this woman, Andrea Smith, wrote this really great piece that kind of breaks it down in a beautiful way that I think helps you further develop a theory of space. And just one thing about 1619 that a lot of people don't know. There were no laws on the books governing slavery because slavery had not yet existed in 1619. But the first laws, right, that became enacted, do you know what they were about? They were about mixed kids, white women and black slaves reproducing, right? Voluntarily reproducing, and the establishment not knowing what to do with these children. What were going to be the status of these children? The first racialized laws of the United States were about organizing, enclosing, controlling this population, right? Just like Central Park was raised because it was a bastion of safe space for disaffected Irish, German, mixed, black, all kinds of communities were living there. And Olmsted, God bless you, rest in peace, bombed them all out. Many of you probably don't know that, so that we could have this beautiful environmental space. So your ideas, your personal ideas and your personal engagement with history and with your space is key, is really key to the future. So anyway, love harder. .files.wordpress, and love to talk to you after.
I'll just add one more, which is Center for Social Inclusion has a program area called Energy Democracy, but on that there are also case studies, and it's not representative of all that's going on, but there are some good case studies on what communities of color are doing around energy innovation with some of the lenses that we've been talking about here. So that's another place to go.
Thank you. So,
And the books that explain that is called The Invention of the White Race, and I recommend you read them. It's a 2-volume series.
you all have a winter reading list here, for sure. But we're going to take a couple questions, and then we're going to be treated by a performance by some new school students. And don't despair if you don't get a chance to ask a question, because guess what? All these panelists are amongst you. These are all faculty. They all have office hours. You can engage with them. We'll be around a bit afterwards as well.
So we have classes you can take in the spring.
We have classes, exactly.
With the classes.
Yeah.
Yes.
When we end, we will go down a list of our classes, and I hope you've been using these hashtags, by the way. Twitter away, the Nth Degree and Sustainable the New School. Okay. Hi, how are you?
Well, how are you? I really love the panel, and I in particular loved the pedagogical focus that you're bringing. And I kept hearing Anna talk about boxes and silos and striving for a collective. And Michelle, you're right now talking about courses. Mm-hmm. And I just want to let all of the new school students know, because I got kind of this negative narrative about we started in science, and then we realized we wanted to be with people. No. And so I just want to remind the new school students that just like everything else we do here at the new school that's different, we do teach natural science, biophysical science, with a social justice framework, with a very strong focus on environmental justice. And I think it gives you more tools to actually go to those front lines or talk about procedural justice or distributive justice in a way that allows you to have more collaboration across spaces. And so I just wanted to bring that up and say,
absolutely.
I'm curious to know if the way that science was taught or being done made you feel that you couldn't do both in an interdisciplinary way. Because I think that's one of the things we're really trying to change about the way we teach science. So I'm just curious if that led to your slight shift in career focus, and if you could talk maybe a little bit about that.
Okay, and before, we definitely want to get your question in, so ask your question, and then we will have the performance. We will answer and then have the performance.
Mm-hmm. How would you want to see private capital and impact investing address economic and environmental justice issues?
Impact investing. Okay. All right. So, he asked how we would want to see capital and social impact investing impact or work with environmental justice. So let's open up to both of those questions. Who wants to speak first?
I was going to speak to the second question, but
Yeah, I mean, the first question, I didn't mean to disparage science in any way. I have a great love and respect for the science degree that I got from Dartmouth College, and I think that it was taught in a very traditional way, and I think the traditional way was to teach the environment is this thing. It's this thing called nature, and it's very pristine, and it's untouched, and there's no historicism, right? There's no historical narrative about it, about who got displaced, who owns it, who doesn't own it. So it was very ahistorical and apolitical. So, and I felt very disenfranchised from that narrative because I didn't understand nature in that way. And so when I went into it, I felt like an other. And so I think the idea to teach students a more integrated version of science and what that narrative could mean. What does the environment and nature really mean? Is it everything around us? And there's some great people doing work on that, and I appreciate that you all at the New School are linking that to students and making them feel like there is a different narrative. There's actually the Union of Concerned Scientists. I was just at a conference with the Union of Concerned Scientists, the Environmental Justice and Science Initiative, that's doing the very difficult work on the ground of reconnecting science and this and the dialogue and discourse with justice and with environmental justice, because it's a very painful history of science and research and communities of color. And so unpacking that and building relationships of trust and building new ways to do science that are not exploitative or marginalizing, I think is really important. And EJ Science and Initiative has toolkits online actually for how you can do science in a collaborative manner and start to unpack some of that stuff, which is great work.
Maya, you want to take?
Yeah, so on the impact, because we've thought about this on the community innovation ownership side, and access to capital is a huge, huge barrier for particularly for low-income communities in general, but low-income communities of color in particular. Actually, not even just low-income. So I'm an acolyte of Morgan Simon's. Does everybody know? So Morgan Simon actually, who has really done globally leading work on social impact investing. A lot of it is not wearing the framework of environment, meaning it's not exclusively on environment, but it really is about how you create, how you invest in and therefore use capital support community cooperatives where, you know, farmers become the owners of their land and not just the labor on the land, for example. And she has a new book out, and in fact, I was thinking we might try to bring her to the New School to talk about her new book, because I don't think we can solve all the problems we want to solve unless we implement some of the, and she has laid out principles of what that investing is, but if you look at some of the projects that she's been able to get capital investing in, it actually creates a whole different investment in community innovation and ownership of people who are traditionally excluded from the society in all kinds of ways that are wrong and inappropriate.
I just add really quickly, there's a great bank called Triodos Bank, and it's in Europe, and there's a great paper, you can Google it, you'll find it's called Banking as If People Mattered. And you know, all of the people that work to distribute the money in this bank, billions of dollars, they're not traditional finance folks. I mean, they actually have an ethical perspective that they've developed, a theory of ethics for the world, right? And so, I think impact investment should, at the very least, have a strong theory and follow models like Triodos. I love community land trusts and cooperative approaches to land. So if I had a bunch of money, I would want big swaths of land in the city, in cities, focused on democratic ownership and experimental play, where you could build lots of cob structures and just kind of like try to live in a completely different way, mortgage free, and try to write and live a different theory of space. So.
I wanted the last word to go to our faculty so you could hear what they're going to be teaching, because they're all new, except for Anna. 3 of them are new, so they've developed new, yes. And Anna's, really, hasn't been around that long either. So you got to hear about these courses.
Race, policy, and discourse. And now I know who all my guest lecturers are. And then the second is a digital equity lab, if you want to get deep and dirty into the city and how we get digital equity to low-income communities of color.
My class is here tonight, Environmental Justice, Race, Class, and the Environment. Every fall and in the spring, I teach sustainability perspectives and practices.
Well, I'll be teaching one day, but right now I'm teaching.
Hey, so my PhD students are here. Milano, it's a qualitative methods course, and a few undergraduate qualitative methods course students are here. Next semester, I'm teaching race, environmental history, and natural resource management. It'll be all case studies around the world. Hope to see some of you.
Next semester, I'm teaching 400 Years of Inequality and Situated Big Data, and I co-teach Urban Colloquium with Bill Morrish and Parsons.
So you see, we have a lot of exciting courses for you all to engage in. Remember, all these faculty have office hours. I want to really thank you all. Mindy, Mia, Manna, Anna, and Maya, and I'm Michelle. So thank you so much for coming. I think you see we have faculty that is unmatched anywhere in terms of these issues on race, equity, and how they intersect with a broad suite of our issues today. So thank you all for coming. Get home safely.